The sky was on fire. Smoke bled into the horizon, swallowing the sun. In May 1940, Europe trembled under the boots of the German blitzkrieg, fast, brutal, unstoppable. Within weeks, Nazi forces crushed the defenses of Belgium and the Netherlands, sweeping toward France like a steel tide. The British Expeditionary Force, sent to defend the continent, suddenly found itself cornered. Each road to safety was cut off, every plan shattered. As towns burned behind them and the enemy closed in, the question echoed through the ranks. Could any of them make it home alive? No one expected France to fall so quickly. The Maginot Line, once called impenetrable, was bypassed with terrifying ease. German panzers tore through the Ardennes forest, moving faster than any army in modern history. French units collapsed under relentless airstrikes, while British troops scrambled to hold the line. By late May, over 400,000 Allied soldiers were pushed back to the northern coast, trapped between the sea and the advancing German army. Dunkirk, a quiet fishing port, suddenly became their last hope. But as the tide rolled in, the soldiers saw no ships waiting. Only endless gray water. The beaches of Dunkirk stretched for miles wide, flat, exposed. There was no cover, no protection, just men and sand. And the sound of distant guns. Thousands gathered in desperate silence, forming long queues that disappeared into the mist. They waited for rescue that might never come. German aircraft circled overhead, dropping bombs that sent sand and blood into the air. The sea turned red, then black with oil. Yet even as death rained from above, the soldiers held their positions. They had no choice. Behind them was the enemy. Ahead the channel, their only escape. In London, panic whispered through the corridors of power. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, only weeks into his leadership, faced an unthinkable truth. Britain's entire army was about to be lost. If Dunkirk fell, the war might end before it truly began. The Royal Navy rushed to organize a massive evacuation, Operation Dynamo, but the challenge was immense. The harbor was shallow, too small for most warships. Time was running out. Churchill ordered the impossible: bring our boys home. The words carried across the channel, but no one knew if they could truly be obeyed. The first attempts to evacuate failed miserably. German dive bombers, the dreaded Stukas, screamed down in near-vertical dives, unleashing chaos. Ships exploded before they even reached the shore. Men burned in the water, their cries lost beneath the roar of engines. Communication broke down. Some officers ordered retreat, others clung to hope. The soldiers on the beach began to realize they were on their own. Food ran short, ammunition dwindled. Yet even in despair, discipline held. They waited, forming lines like ghosts in uniform, faces covered in ash, eyes hollow, hearts beating to one thought: hold on. Night brought a fragile peace. The sea glimmered under a pale moon, reflecting the glow of burning cities behind them. Some soldiers prayed. Others stared silently into the horizon, imagining the shores of England, so close, yet impossibly far. Around campfires made from wreckage, men spoke of home, of mothers and sweethearts, of pubs and quiet streets. Then, suddenly, the silence shattered. Artillery thundered again. The Germans had reached the perimeter. The Dunkirk pocket was closing. If reinforcements didn't arrive soon, the entire British army would vanish beneath the waves. At sea, the Royal Navy fought to open a path. Destroyers and minesweepers braved torpedo attacks to reach the coast, dodging bombs that fell like hail. Each mile was a gamble, each rescue a miracle. They managed to lift a few thousand men on the first day, then a few more the next, but the numbers were grim. At this rate, it would take weeks to evacuate everyone. The army had days, maybe less. As Churchill's advisors debated surrender terms in secret, the Prime Minister refused. "We shall never give in," he growled, but even defiance couldn't stop the tide. And then a miracle began. Word spread across Britain: the Navy needed help. Ordinary citizens, fishermen, ferry captains, and sailors of every kind answered the call. They brought anything that could float: tugboats, yachts, lifeboats, pleasure craft. Over 800 civilian vessels prepared to cross the channel into a war zone. They called them the little ships. For the men stranded on the beach, the sight of tiny silhouettes emerging from the mist would soon mean salvation or sacrifice. No one knew how many would return. But they went anyway, because someone had to. On May 27th, the full evacuation began. The tide was low, forcing troops to wade through freezing water to reach the ships. Some drowned beneath the weight of their packs. Others clung to rope ladders, praying as bombs fell around them. The Navy's destroyers took on as many as they could before pulling away under fire. From the shore, the men watched each departing vessel vanish into smoke, unsure if they'd ever see another one come back. Every hour counted. Every man saved was a victory snatched from chaos, yet still hundreds of thousands remained. The Germans could have crushed them completely, but they didn't. Hitler ordered his tanks to halt, a mysterious decision. Historians still debate. Some say he wanted to spare resources. Others believe he feared the marshy terrain. Whatever the reason, the pause gave the Allies precious time. The Luftwaffe continued bombing relentlessly, but the British fighter pilots of the RAF fought back with ferocity. Above Dunkirk, a deadly ballet unfolded, Spitfires versus Messerschmitts, dueling in spirals of fire and smoke. For the soldiers below, the roar of friendly engines overhead felt like hope made flesh. Back on the beaches, chaos turned to rhythm. Military police organized lines. Engineers built makeshift piers out of trucks, barrels, and debris, anything to reach deeper water. The mole, a long stone jetty, became the heart of the operation. Thousands crossed it under constant attack, waiting for ships that sometimes never came. The men moved like clockwork, silent and disciplined, despite exhaustion and fear. One soldier wrote, "We were ants, crawling toward salvation." Day after day, the line inched forward, even as the world around them burned. Civilians joined the fight from across the sea. Fathers and sons navigated their small boats through minefields and strafing runs, pulling shivering soldiers from the waves. Some never returned, sunk by bombs or crushed by panic. Yet they kept coming. The channel became a living artery between two nations, pulsing with courage and loss. One survivor later said, "When I saw that little boat, I wept. I knew we were not forgotten." Against all odds, the evacuation accelerated. Dunkirk was no longer a defeat. It was becoming a story of defiance. By May 30th, more than 120,000 men had been rescued, but the beaches were still full. The Germans tightened the noose, shelling every exit, bombing every route. Each hour, the smoke grew thicker, the screams louder, and yet the tide of men moving toward the sea did not stop. They marched in silence, their boots sinking into sand soaked with oil and blood. Officers barked orders through the din. The sky flickered orange, reflecting off helmets like dying stars. Dunkirk had become a nightmare, and a miracle unfolding at once. In England, families gathered around radios. They listened in terror, hearing fragments of reports, heavy casualties, under fire. Rescue ongoing. Mothers clutched photos. Children whispered prayers. The nation held its breath. Churchill ordered every available ship to keep sailing day and night. The channel became a highway of courage. As the rescue stretched into its fourth day, the impossible began to feel within reach. But then, word came, the Luftwaffe was preparing one last massive strike. The beaches would burn once more. Dawn broke red over Dunkirk. The bombers came in waves, screaming across the sky. Explosions tore through the harbor. The mole cracked. Ships burned at anchor. Men threw themselves into the water to escape the flames. Yet the boats kept coming, weaving through smoke and wreckage to snatch survivors from the edge of hell. For every vessel destroyed, another took its place. Courage filled the channel like a tide. As night fell again, the impossible rescue continued. One soul at a time. They called it the longest queue to heaven. Hour after hour, men stood waist-deep in the surf, silent, shivering, waiting for salvation. The air reeked of oil and gunpowder. Some stared blankly into the distance. Others murmured prayers, lips trembling. Around them, corpses floated like driftwood. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the line, but no one broke formation. They had seen too much already. Above them, flares turned the sky into a ghostly dawn. "If this is the end," one soldier whispered, "then let it come from the sea." But the sea was just beginning to answer. Small boats appeared first, specks on the horizon. Each one carried ordinary people who had become heroes overnight. A postman from Kent, a fisherman from Brighton, a teenage boy steering his father's yacht. They braved bombers, waves, and fear itself. Some ferried only a handful of men at a time, but each crossing mattered. The soldiers cheered weakly as they climbed aboard, their boots leaving prints of mud and blood on polished decks. For a moment, war felt far away. For a moment, the world still made sense, and then, the next siren screamed, the Luftwaffe returned with vengeance. Dive bombers strafed the beaches, machine guns chattering like typewriters of death. Men scattered, diving into trenches of sand. Smoke covered everything, thick, black, choking. Ships sank in seconds, swallowed by fire and water. Yet through the chaos, the rescue continued. We pulled men out of the flames, one sailor recalled, and went back for more. The channel became a graveyard and a lifeline. Every ship that left Dunkirk carried not just soldiers, but the fragile hope of a nation unwilling to die. In the chaos, acts of quiet heroism shone through. A chaplain refused to leave, staying behind to comfort the wounded. Engineers held the line at the canal bridges, buying time for others to escape. A Royal Navy officer guided ships through burning wreckage until shrapnel claimed his life. Their stories spread like whispers through the ranks, reminders that even in hell, humanity endured. Courage, Churchill later said, is not just standing firm when all else collapses. And at Dunkirk, everything had collapsed except the will to survive. For many, survival came down to luck. A step left instead of right. A moment's pause before running. One soldier recalled watching his best friend disappear in a flash of fire, gone before he could blink. Another found himself alone in the smoke, guided only by the sound of waves. When rescue boats filled up, men clung to their sides, drifting behind like shadows. Some froze in the water, whispering names that would never be answered. By nightfall, the tide carried them away, silent witnesses to a miracle still unfolding. On the fifth day, the scale of the operation defied belief. Hundreds of boats now moved in constant rhythm, loading, sailing, returning. The Royal Navy coordinated convoys under constant attack while the RAF battled overhead. Pilots fought until their fuel ran dry, some ditching in the sea to save those below. "We fought for the men on that beach," one pilot said later. Not for glory, for home. Dunkirk had become a living symbol of unity. Soldiers, sailors, civilians, all fighting one war together. The rescue was no longer just an operation, it was destiny. By May 31st, nearly 200,000 men had escaped. But time was running out. German forces tightened their circle, cutting off roads and bombarding the last defensive positions. French units fought desperately to protect the evacuation perimeter, knowing they might never leave. Their stand was heroic and fatal. "Tell England," one French captain said, "we held the line." Their sacrifice bought another day of life for tens of thousands. It was the kind of courage history too often forgets, or never truly loses. Meanwhile, the beaches grew eerily quiet. Bodies littered the shoreline, mixed with helmets and burned-out trucks. The stench of death mingled with the salt air. In the distance, the horizon shimmered, not from sunlight, but from burning oil slicks. A British officer walked the beach, counting men, whispering encouragement. "Hold fast," he said again and again, though his voice trembled. The sea had become both their executioner and their savior. Somewhere beyond the smoke, England waited, a promise of home no bomb could erase. The final phase of the evacuation began under moonlight. The Navy pushed deeper into the shallows, risking everything to collect the last stranded troops. Destroyers ran aground, boats caught fire. Some commanders refused to leave until every man was aboard. The air buzzed with tracer fire, the water boiling from near misses. Yet somehow, the line kept moving. Soldiers crawled across wrecks and debris to reach waiting ships. "We could see home in our minds," one survivor said, and that was enough. Dunkirk was fading behind them, but not its ghosts. For those left behind, there was no illusion. The French rearguard, brave, exhausted, made their stand in the ruins of the town. They fought street by street, house by house, until ammunition ran dry. The Germans advanced relentlessly, firing through smoke and rubble, yet the French didn't break. They fought until capture, ensuring the final British boats could sail away. "They saved us," one British officer admitted years later, by choosing not to save themselves. The last shots of Dunkirk echoed into the sea, and then silence. When the guns finally stopped, 338,000 men had been rescued. The number defied imagination. Soldiers filled every port from Dover to Ramsgate, their uniforms torn, faces gray from exhaustion. Some wept openly as they touched British soil. Others stared blankly, haunted by what they'd seen. They had survived the impossible, but at a cost few could describe. Behind them, Dunkirk burned for days. The beaches were littered with the wrecks of war, twisted metal, empty helmets, letters never sent. For every man who made it home, another had fallen to make it possible. In London, Churchill delivered his famous speech. He called Dunkirk a miracle of deliverance, but warned that wars are not won by evacuations. Still, his words ignited something deeper. Resolve. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. "We shall never surrender." Across Britain, those words became scripture. Dunkirk was not victory, but it was survival, and survival meant hope. In the darkest hour, the British people discovered a new kind of strength, one born from unity, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Back in France, German troops marched into Dunkirk's ruins. The harbor was silent now, except for the crackle of burning ships. They found abandoned rifles, broken helmets, and the smell of defeat, but no army to capture. Hitler raged. British had escaped. The world had witnessed something he hadn't planned for, the rebirth of British defiance. What began as a rout had turned into legend. From that moment, the war changed. Britain would stand alone, but no longer afraid. The fire of Dunkirk would light their path. For the survivors, the war was far from over. Many were sent back into battle only weeks later, fighting in North Africa, Italy, and beyond. Yet something inside them had shifted. They had seen the edge of oblivion and returned. They carried the memory of that beach like a scar, a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to keep moving through it. "We left our youth in Dunkirk," one veteran said softly, "but we brought back our spirit. That spirit would soon inspire an entire world." Dunkirk was over, but its echo had just begun. Across the Atlantic, Americans watched in awe as newsreels showed endless lines of men rescued from the jaws of annihilation. President Roosevelt called it proof of British endurance. Hollywood would later turn it into myth, but the truth was already mythic enough. From ashes and sea spray, a new narrative emerged, not of defeat, but deliverance. The soldiers called it the second birth. The world called it hope reborn. The sea turned red. Oil slicks burned across the waves, lighting the faces of the wounded floating in silence. Men whispered prayers, some clutching photographs, others just staring at the horizon. Yet the small boats kept coming, unarmed, unarmored, unstoppable. Fishermen, bankers, fathers pilots of hope steering through fire. They hauled soldiers from freezing water, stacking them on decks meant for fish or cargo. Each trip meant gambling with death. And still, they turned back for more, because every man left behind was a life unfinished. Every face lost to the tide was a piece of home fading away. Nightfall offered no peace. German bombers prowled in the darkness, guided by flares and moonlight. The sea, once calm, now glowed with fire and wreckage. Rescue boats moved like shadows between burning ships. Orders were shouted over static radios. "Keep going! Keep going!" while shells whistled overhead. The sound of engines, the smell of salt and smoke, blended into one endless nightmare. Some crews went missing, swallowed by the channel, but others pressed on. Hands trembling on the wheel, eyes fixed on the faint beam of Dover's light in the distance. On the beaches, time stood still. Thousands huddled under makeshift shelters of sand and metal. They wrote last letters to mothers, wives, children folded them into pockets never meant to be emptied. "If I don't make it," one soldier wrote, "tell them I tried." Around him, others stared blankly at the waves, waiting for the miracle that might never come. And yet, the rumble of engines on the horizon hinted at hope. Tiny dots grew larger, shimmering through the smoke. The boats were coming again, defying reason, defying fear. The rescue wasn't over. It had only just begun. They called it the arm of God. That stretch of sea between Dunkirk and Dover became a lifeline narrow, deadly, sacred. Over 800 vessels crossed those waters, from military destroyers to paddle steamers and fishing trawlers. Together they moved 338,000 souls from the edge of annihilation. Each return trip a race against bombs and fire. Each wave a test of endurance. The soldiers called it a deliverance. The sailors called it duty. History would call it a miracle. But even miracles sometimes demand blood. Many never came back. Their names lost to the sea that both saved and swallowed them. Churchill watched in silence. In London, reports poured in chaotic, unbelievable. Against every military prediction, the British Expeditionary Force was coming home. But victory was not the word he used. Wars are not won by evacuations, he reminded Parliament. His tone was grim, but his heart carried fire. Dunkirk was not an ending, it was a promise, a vow that Britain would not surrender. Outside Westminster, church bells rang not for triumph, but survival. And across the Channel, those left behind still fought, delaying the inevitable so others could live. The French stood their ground. While the last British boats departed, tens of thousands of French soldiers formed a rear guard around Dunkirk's perimeter. They fought street by street, outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by fate. Their orders were simple by time, and they did, with everything they had. Many were captured, some were executed, few made it home. But their sacrifice became the silent backbone of the miracle. Without them, no one would have escaped. Their courage was written not in speeches or medals, but in blood on the cobblestones of Dunkirk. June 4th, 1940. The last ship departed under cover of smoke. On shore, only ruins remained, shattered vehicles, abandoned rifles, and silence heavy enough to break a man's heart. The evacuation was over. Dunkirk had fallen, but the spirit it awakened would not die. In total, 338,226 soldiers were rescued. Britain still had an army, a nation that had tasted despair, found defiance instead. In Churchill's next speech, his voice thundered across radios and hearts alike. "We shall fight on the beaches." The words echoed like gunfire, shaping history itself. The world listened. For the first time, the myth of invincible Germany cracked. Across occupied Europe, whispers of hope began to spread. In a miracle, newspapers called it the miracle of Dunkirk. Families who had never heard of that French port now spoke its name with reverence. Children played with toy boats, imagining the rescue. It was more than a military escape, it was proof that courage could defy logic, that even in retreat, humanity could triumph. Dunkirk became not a symbol of defeat but rebirth, a spark that would ignite the Allied return. Hope has a shadow. For every man saved, another was lost. The beaches were graveyards, littered with helmets and letters half buried in the sand. The tide washed away footprints but not memories. Survivors returned home, haunted faces pale, eyes distant, carrying ghosts no one could see. Many couldn't speak of what they'd witnessed. Some never did. The trauma of Dunkirk lingered long after the guns fell silent. In pubs and parlors, mothers asked questions that never found answers, and the sea kept its secrets. In hospitals, silence reigned. Rows of stretchers lined the halls, filled with men who looked both alive and absent. Nurses moved quietly between them, bandaging wounds that went far beyond flesh. "You're safe now," they whispered. But safety was a fragile word. Some trembled at the sound of thunder. Others woke screaming from dreams of drowning. The war would continue, but these men, they had already fought it twice. Once on the beaches, once inside their own minds. Dunkirk was not just survival, it was the beginning of remembrance. Back in Dover, the boats rested, their hulls scorched, decks dented, names faded by salt and smoke. The owners walked the piers in silence, touching the railings like relics of faith. These weren't warships, they were symbols of defiance, of unity, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The British called them the little ships, and each one carried a story. Some never returned. Others became museum pieces, drifting reminders of a moment when courage crossed the sea, when a nation refused to let its sons die alone. Decades later, survivors still remembered the sound, the distant hum of vengeance, the crash of waves against steel, the voice of a comrade shouting their name through smoke. Memory blurred with myth, but the feeling remained raw, immediate, alive. For them, Dunkirk wasn't history, it was yesterday. The smell of burning oil, the taste of salt on their lips, They spoke of it not as soldiers, but as witnesses to something greater than war, something eternal, a moment when humanity stood on the edge and chose hope. Films and books would try to capture it. Writers called it destiny. Directors painted it in black and white, then in color, then in IMAX glory. Yet the real story wasn't about explosions or tactics. It was about the heartbeat of survival, about men who refused to be forgotten, about a sea that swallowed fear and returned faith. Dunkirk became legend, not because of victory, but because of endurance. Because sometimes the greatest heroism lies in holding on when everything else falls apart. Even now, the Channel remembers. Each tide whispers over the sands where so many fell. The wind still carries echoes of their last words. Fishermen say on quiet mornings you can still hear engines distant, ghostly fading into mist. History doesn't end. It lingers. It breathes in the waves, in the cliffs, in the hearts of those who remember. Dunkirk was not a battle of conquest. It was a battle for the soul, and its echoes still reach across generations, reminding us who we are when everything seems lost. But this isn't where the story ends. Because Dunkirk wasn't the end of Britain's struggle, it was the spark of its defiance. The men who returned would fight again in Africa, in the skies, in Normandy. The same courage that rose from those beaches would one day return to liberate Europe. The impossible rescue became the foundation of victory yet to come. And as the world prepared for its darkest hours, the lesson of Dunkirk burned brighter than ever hope. When shared, becomes unstoppable. The war raged on. London burned under the Blitz. Europe fell deeper into darkness. But somewhere beneath the rubble and smoke, a quiet faith endured. The men rescued at Dunkirk rejoined their units scarred but unbroken. They trained again, marched again, believing that survival itself was purpose. Dunkirk had taught them something no weapon could destroy: unity. They had seen the strength of ordinary people when fate turned cruel, and that belief would carry them through the storms still to come. Across the Atlantic, the world watched. In America, the Dunkirk story became a spark for empathy. Maybe Europe still has a chance, one newspaper read. Civilians sent supplies, volunteers enlisted, and whispers of intervention began to grow. Dunkirk didn't win a battle it won hearts. It reminded the free world that resistance was still alive, that courage, even cornered, could stand taller than tyranny. And though it would take another year before the U.S. entered the war, the seed of solidarity had been planted in the hearts of millions who refused to look away. For Churchill, it was personal. He had seen the faces of boys turned men, and men turned ghosts. Each evacuation report carried names, some saved, some lost forever. But through it all, he carried one conviction: that Britain's survival would light the way for freedom itself. He called Dunkirk a miracle of deliverance. Yet behind his iron tone, there was mourning too, for the price of that miracle paid in silence by those who never came home. His resolve hardened, his speeches sharpened, and the island nation prepared to stand alone. In the years that followed, Dunkirk became more than memory. It became identity. The phrase Dunkirk spirit entered the British vocabulary, symbolizing resilience, unity, and quiet defiance. It wasn't about victory. It was about refusing to collapse. Even today, when crisis strikes, people invoke that same spirit. Remember Dunkirk? It means, remember what courage looks like when the world is falling apart. Remember that ordinary hands can rewrite impossible endings. The beaches may have long gone quiet, but the lesson still roars in every heartbeat of a free people. Yet history has a way of softening its edges. We speak of courage, not terror. Of rescue, not chaos. But Dunkirk was both a nightmare wrapped in a miracle. The truth lies between the waves and the whispers. Between men who prayed for dawn and those who never saw it. To remember Dunkirk fully, we must remember everything. The fear, the loss, the unbearable waiting, because that's what makes its hope so powerful. It wasn't born from glory, it was born from desperation, and that's what makes it human. Some say the sea itself was on their side. Winds shifted, storms delayed German attacks, and cloud cover hid escaping boats. Coincidence or providence? No one can say, but those who were there remember it differently. It felt, one veteran said, like the sea wanted us home. Perhaps that's why Dunkirk endures not just as history, but as faith. A belief that even when logic fails, something greater can still guide us through the fire. A whisper across time, reminding us to hold on. Today the beaches are calm. Tourists walk where soldiers once fell. Children collect shells where helmets once lay. The tide has washed away the scars, but not the silence. Every grain of sand holds echoes of that week in 1940, the footsteps, the cries, the final goodbyes. Standing there, you can almost hear the hum of engines, the distant sirens, the heartbeat of a nation reborn. Dunkirk is no longer a place of tragedy. It is a testament to what humanity can endure when there's nowhere left to run. Veterans grew old. Their stories faded into archives and interviews. But every May, when the wind turns cold and the sea grows gray, memories resurface. Old men stand by the cliffs, eyes wet, saluting ghosts only they can see. We were just boys, they say softly. We just wanted to go home. Their words hang in the air, fragile, timeless. Dunkirk may belong to history now, but for them, will always be the moment life stood still. The moment courage found a name. Modern Britain still carries that name. Through crisis, through loss, through the quiet wars of daily life, the spirit of Dunkirk lives on. It's in the volunteer helping a stranger, the rescuer who dives into danger, the voice that says, "We'll find a way." The world has changed, but the human heart hasn't. We still face impossible odds. We still stand together or fall apart. And when darkness comes again, it always does, we remember. Once, against all odds, humanity chose hope. For filmmakers, historians, and dreamers, Dunkirk remains a mirror. A reflection of what we fear and what we're capable of. Christopher Nolan's 2017 film reignited global awe for the story, blending realism with silence, chaos with grace. But the truth doesn't need soundtracks or effects. It lives in the quiet moments, in trembling hands, in whispered prayers, in the sight of a fishing boat steering toward hell. The greatest scenes of Dunkirk were written not on film, but on water, with courage as its ink. Every generation rediscovers it. The idea that survival itself can be heroic, that unity can defy annihilation. In classrooms, in documentaries, in fading photographs, Dunkirk is retold not as a victory but as a vow. A vow that humanity will not surrender to despair. That even when surrounded by darkness, we can still move toward the light. Because Dunkirk was never just about war. It was about life, fragile, sacred, and worth saving. 80 years have passed. The survivors are gone. The ships rust in harbors, their names barely legible. But their legacy endures in every act of courage, in every choice to stand rather than yield. History is not a story of kings or generals. It's a story of ordinary souls doing extraordinary things when no one else would. That is the real miracle of Dunkirk. Not escape, not victory, but endurance. The unbreakable will to keep moving forward together. As the sun sets over the channel, the sea glows gold. The same sea that once carried fear now carries memory, a reflection of all who crossed it alive or not. And if you listen closely above the wind, you might still hear them. Voices of courage, laughter, and loss blending with the waves. They speak softly, almost like a promise we came home. The sound fades with the tide, but the feeling remains. Eternal, unfinished, alive in every beating heart that still remembers. History calls it the miracle of Dunkirk. But perhaps the true miracle wasn't the escape at all. It was the choice to try, to row into chaos, to stand in the fire. To believe that one act of compassion could change the fate of thousands. That is what saved a nation. That is what keeps saving us still. Because every time humanity stands together, the impossible becomes possible again. Dunkirk was proof of that truth. Proof, as history shows, never fades.
I'll remember this.
When the world feels lost, when the waves rise higher than hope itself, remember the beaches of Dunkirk, remember the men who waited, the boats that came, the courage that refused to die. History isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to carry forward. And if their story moves you, let it live again. Like, comment, share their legacy. Keep it alive for the next generation. Because the spirit of Dunkirk doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to all of us. Still fighting, still believing, still standing against the tide.